Chapter 1. The Portrait That Blinked. It was one of those evenings in early October when the air holds the faintest hint of winter's breath, and the last golden threads of summer cling stubbornly to the hedgerows. The Finchley estate of Lady Eugenia Hargrove stood aloof from the creeping chill, resplendent in its ivy-cloaked grandeur, lit from within like a jewel. Lanterns cast golden pools across the gravel drive. Inside, the drawing-room buzzed with the polite friction of high society. Laughter, secrets cloaked in civility, and the occasional sharp glint of rivalry that needed only the thinnest of pretexts to ignite. The occasion was Lady Eugenia's much-anticipated annual soirée, an affair that drew London's elite to the countryside with the irresistible lure of influence, legacy, and carefully curated gossip. The guest list glittered with titled names and hidden scandals. There was the newly widowed Viscountess Lily Breton, her mourning lace daringly sheer; Sebastian Vale, the razor-tongued art critic whose insults sold more newspapers than praise; Dr. Alaric Finch, neurologist and amateur mesmerist; the American industrialist Henry Haskett and his unnervingly silent daughter Clara; and, of course, Lady Eugenia herself, sharp-eyed, iron-spined, and entirely aware that power was rarely a thing of sound, but of silence. And then there was the portrait. It hung above the marble fireplace, a brooding oil of Lady Eugenia's late husband, Admiral Bertram Hargrove, captured in a tempest of navy and storm grey, one hand resting ominously on a telescope, the other curled in an unfinished gesture. Some said a salute, others said a warning. But tonight, for the first time in all the years it had watched over this room, a low murmur was spreading among the guests like a whispered contagion. The portrait blinked. No one had seen it exactly. Not at first, but it began with a gasp from Clara Haskett, pale, wide-eyed, rigid in her seat, and was followed by nervous titters from the younger guests and speculative glances from the older ones. Dr. Finch declared the notion a fine example of collective hysteria triggered by the visual fatigue of flickering candlelight. Vale, predictably, used it to launch into a monologue on the performative nature of grief in oil painting. Lady Eugenia, for her part, dismissed it with a brittle smile. "Bertram never did care for theatrics," she said, "least of all from beyond the veil." But the tension lingered. As the evening wore on, Clara Haskett retreated upstairs, pale and trembling, escorted by the butler. Someone mentioned the Admiral's service pistol, still kept in a locked display case in the study, and wondered aloud whether it was truly unloaded. And then, at precisely 9:35, a scream sliced through the quiet. It was the maid, Elsie, shaking and breathless, her apron torn, her voice stumbling over a single phrase. "The study. It's him. He's there. He's dead." The guests surged as one toward the West Wing corridor, led by Lady Eugenia, who, despite her age, moved with astonishing force. The study door was flung wide, and there, beneath the heavy velvet drapes and the scent of wood polish and pipe smoke, lay the body of Sebastian Vale. His cravat was twisted, his face slack, eyes wide in frozen disbelief. In his hand was a page torn from a small red notebook. On it, scrawled in a frantic, jagged hand, were just 3 words. The portrait blinked. Silence followed, the kind that thickens like fog. It was broken only by the slow creak of the door closing behind them and the distant toll of the grandfather clock in the hall. Lady Eugenia stared at the body, her face unreadable. "Call the police," she said quietly, "and inform Monsieur Poirot." Someone gasped. Another whispered, "Poirot! The Poirot!" Lady Eugenia didn't turn. "Yes, Hercule Poirot. Tell him to come at once, and tell him to bring his little grey cells. I believe they shall be most needed." Far across the city, sat in a flat that overlooked the Thames like a contented observer of chaos, Hercule Poirot, recently returned from an engagement in Brussels, received the call with a gentle raising of his eyebrows. He was not unfamiliar with Lady Eugenia's flair for dramatics, but a death during one of her famed gatherings. A death tied, no less, to a blinking portrait. He put down the telephone, straightened his cuffs, and turned to his companion. "Mon ami," he said to Hastings, who had been dozing lightly in an armchair, "we are summoned. There has been a murder, and if I am not mistaken also, a lie hidden in plain sight." Hastings blinked. "A lie?" Poirot gave the faintest of smiles. "But of course, they always begin with lies. Let us go and catch it before it learns to run." And so, beneath a cloak of autumn fog, as Finchley Estate sealed itself behind drawn curtains and fearful glances, Hercule Poirot set off to confront a portrait, a corpse, and a gathering of guests, each one wearing their most charming mask, and perhaps hiding something far more dangerous underneath. Chapter 2. The First Clues. The following morning unfolded in a hush that hung like fog over Finchley Estate. The once giddy echoes of Lady Eugenia's soirée had vanished, leaving a strained quiet in their place. Breakfast was not served in the conservatory, as tradition dictated, but in the smaller morning room, where the guests sat scattered and subdued, their cups of tea clinking too loudly in the silence. A uniformed constable stood outside the west wing, and the door to the study remained closed with a single sheet of crested paper affixed to it, sealed by order of the police. It was into this heavy atmosphere that Hercule Poirot arrived. He stepped from the hired car with deliberate poise, a silver-headed cane in one hand and his trilby in the other. Every detail of his attire was immaculate: the perfectly brushed overcoat, the spotless gloves, the faintest trace of cologne that hinted at orange blossom and discretion. His eyes, dark and inquisitive, swept the facade of the manor as though reading a riddle etched in its windows. Lady Eugenia met him in the drawing-room, her posture regal even in grief. She wore mourning black, of course, but tailored exquisitely and without theatrical excess. Her cane rested lightly by the mantelpiece, and the fire crackled as if defying the morning's chill. "Monsieur Poirot," she said with a nod, "thank you for coming." "You are gracious to call upon me, Lady Eugenia. I'm at your service." He bowed slightly and followed her gesture to sit. "You may ask me anything," she said, "and I expect you will." "I shall," Poirot said gently. "But first, madame, if you please, a moment in the study." A flicker crossed her face. "Of course. But you must understand, the body has been removed, and the official inspector, Inspector Mallory, has made it quite clear that you are unofficial." Poirot smiled. "That has never deterred me before." He stood and followed a footman toward the sealed study, where a constable lifted the police tape with an air of reluctant respect. The door opened, and Poirot stepped into a room suspended in unease. It was as if the study had exhaled sharply and never breathed in again. The armchair where Vale had died remained in place, though now empty. The bookshelves were lined with naval histories, atlases, and legal tomes. The Admiral's desk stood fastidiously neat, save for one disorder: a drawer slightly ajar, its handle smudged as if tugged in haste. A long Turkish rug stretched across the floor, rumpled subtly at the edges. Poirot moved slowly, touching nothing, yet observing everything. His gaze lingered on a mahogany display case bolted to the wall. Inside, as promised, was Admiral Hargrove's service revolver, or rather, the outline of it. The velvet interior showed the clear impression of a missing weapon. "Curious," Poirot murmured. The butler, Foster, hovered in the hallway and cleared his throat. "Sir, may I be of service?" "Indeed, monsieur," Poirot said, stepping lightly to the doorway. "Last night, after the scream, were you the first to enter?" "I was, sir. The maid, Elsie, had raised the alarm. I came running." "Was the door locked?" "No, sir. Ajar, if anything. Mr. Vale was, well, He had clearly collapsed. Lady Eugenia insisted I telephone the authorities. Inspector Mallory arrived just after 11. Poirot nodded slowly. "Was this drawer?" he motioned. "Open, then, as it is now?" "No, sir, that I cannot say. My attention was rather focused elsewhere." Poirot walked to the desk and used a handkerchief to gently slide the drawer open. Inside, nestled among fountain pens, was a small notebook. Red, frayed at the edges, just like the torn page found in Vale's hand. He lifted it with great care, flipping slowly through the pages. Most were blank, but near the end, several were written in a hurried, looping scrawl. "Eugenia watches everything, but not everyone sees her watching. Clara doesn't sleep. The girl hears things I can't explain." He said the portrait moved. I thought he was joking, but now. Poirot narrowed his eyes. The ink had smudged slightly on one page, as if tears or sweat had struck it. "Parfait," he whispered. The man was frightened, but not of ghosts. No, of what the others might call madness. He closed the notebook and handed it to the constable. Returning to the drawing-room, Poirot found Lady Eugenia examining the portrait again, its oil eyes inscrutable in the morning light. "It is said," she murmured, "that the Admiral disliked Sebastian Vale immensely. But then again, Bertram disliked most people. May I ask why?" Sebastian fancied himself cleverer than he was. His critiques were personal, wounding. Bertram had no time for cruelty disguised as intellect. And yet he was invited. She smiled thinly. "I like to know what my enemies are saying. Easier to watch them when they're in your house." Poirot bowed slightly. "Lady Eugenia, I do not ask this lightly, but may I speak with your other guests?" "They are yours to question, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "But do remember, the living lie, the dead only whisper." Poirot stepped out, his gaze drifting again to the portrait. It did not blink, but something in the air shifted all the same. Down the hall the guests stirred. Clara Haskett had refused breakfast. Dr. Finch sat sharpening a pencil over a crossword. Viscountess Breton spoke low into the telephone with her back turned. Each of them, Poirot knew, had already constructed their version of the truth. It was his task, now, to dismantle each illusion. And perhaps, somewhere among their secrets, to find out why a man had scrawled a warning with his dying breath. The portrait blinked. And what, in heaven's name, he had truly seen. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. Poirot took his seat in the smaller salon, which had been hastily transformed into a makeshift interview chamber. The sunlight filtered through the gauzy curtains, softening the sharp edges of the room and painting delicate gold streaks across the Turkish carpet. Foster, the ever-discreet butler, stood by the door with a leather-bound notepad in hand, awaiting Poirot's instructions. "One by one, if you please," Poirot said. "Let us begin with Viscountess Breton." Lady Breton entered with a composed elegance that seemed rehearsed. Her gown was pearl grey, her veil modest but perfectly arranged, and the diamond brooch at her throat gleamed with icy restraint. She sat opposite Poirot and crossed her legs with the practiced ease of a woman accustomed to being scrutinized. "You were close to Monsieur Vale?" Poirot asked softly. A pause. Then, "Close? That is a word with many edges, Monsieur Poirot. Sebastian and I were acquainted. We had an understanding of sorts, but not the sort you're likely imagining." "I imagine only what I observe, madame," Poirot replied, his voice silky. "And I observe that you are grieving, but not shocked." She smiled faintly. "That's because Sebastian made enemies as easily as he made critiques. It was only a matter of time before someone returned the favor." Poirot tilted his head. "And yet you attended this gathering with him." Her fingers tightened slightly around her gloves. "I was not his guest. I was Lady Eugenia's. Sebastian invited himself." Did he speak of any concerns? Fears? She hesitated, just long enough for Poirot to note it. He was rattled, paranoid even. Said something peculiar the night before, about reflections. Reflections? She looked away. He said the Admiral's eyes were following him. He couldn't sleep, blamed the portrait. Poirot watched her for a beat longer, then nodded to Foster. Merci, Lady Breton. Please send in Dr. Finch. As she departed, Dr. Alaric Finch entered in a cloud of bergamot and starch. His spectacles gleamed in the light, and he carried a notepad with the corners dog-eared and worn smooth. Ah, the esteemed Monsieur Poirot, he said with theatrical gravity. Always a pleasure to observe another mind at work. Poirot gestured to the chair. And I too, observe. Let us do so together, eh? Tell me, Doctor, your impressions of the deceased? Vale? Bright, certainly. Articulate. Razor-witted. But he could be cruel. His reviews were more autopsies than essays. Still, I dare say he didn't deserve to be murdered. Perhaps not. But the portrait, Doctor. Vale feared it. Do you find that credible? Finch's smile twitched. The subconscious is powerful, Monsieur Poirot. Vale had been drinking more than usual. Perhaps a hallucination, perhaps a moment of disassociation. And what of Clara Haskett? The doctor stiffened subtly. A sensitive girl. Far too sensitive for this place. Her father dotes on her, but she's fragile. Did she speak of the portrait? Finch hesitated. She did. Claimed she saw it blink. Her voice was trembling. I assumed it was a projection of trauma. She's recently lost her mother. You know. I did not know, Poirot murmured. Grief can conjure strange shadows, n'est-ce pas? Finch nodded slowly, but Poirot caught the faintest flicker of discomfort in the man's jaw. Thank you, Doctor. Now, Monsieur Haskett. Henry Haskett entered next, a barrel of a man with a booming presence and an American accent as crisp as newly printed dollars. His hands were large and rough at the edges despite his tailored suit, and his blue eyes remained alert, suspicious. I'm not thrilled to be questioned like this, Mr. Poirot, he began, but I understand it's necessary. Only necessary to truth, monsieur, Poirot replied. Your daughter, she has suffered greatly. Haskett's jaw tensed. She has. We came here to give her some peace. Thought the English countryside would help. I didn't expect her to end up in the middle of a murder. And Monsieur Vale, did you know him well? No. Met him once before. He was the kind of man who'd laugh at a crippled dog. Arrogant, full of opinions he didn't earn. Did you see him the night of the murder? Haskett's brow furrowed. Briefly. He was pacing the hall, muttering about shadows and the Admiral's eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Poirot nodded. And Clara? Where was she? In her room. She hasn't been well. She's sensitive to loud voices, crowds, strangers. She saw something that night. She won't talk about it, but she's afraid. Poirot's voice softened. I would like to speak to her. Gently. Haskett hesitated. She's resting now, but I'll let her know. As the industrialist left, Poirot stood, pacing slowly to the fireplace where the portrait of Admiral Hargrove loomed above. There was something uncanny about it. Even he, a rationalist to the core, felt a subtle discomfort under the Admiral's oil-dark gaze. Foster re-entered. Sir, shall I prepare the young lady for your visit? Please, Poirot said, but gently. A quiet word with Clara may illuminate much. He turned once more toward the chair where Vale had collapsed. A man terrified in his final hours, a man holding a torn page like a message in a bottle. The guests were assembling again in the drawing-room, murmurs low and restrained. There were still more truths to uncover, more lies to catch in the moment before they landed. But Poirot had seen enough for one morning to know this. The truth did not reside in shadows or superstition. It was among the living, threaded through tone and timing in what was said too quickly, or not at all, and he would pull that thread, slowly and patiently, until the portrait blinked no more. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. Though he had already been at Finchley for a few hours, it was only now, after observing the study, the guests, and the subtle atmosphere of decay, that Hercule Poirot truly arrived. For Poirot, entry was never marked by the turning of a key or the laying down of a suitcase. It was a mental crossing, the moment he stepped entirely into the puzzle, and the puzzle, as it stood, was disturbingly elegant. The facts thus far were deceptively sparse. Sebastian Vale, a respected but abrasive art critic, had been found dead in the study of Admiral Hargrove's estate, a note in his hand warning of a blinking portrait. The service pistol, once housed in a locked case on the study wall, was missing. The guests had each offered something of interest, emotionally charged hesitations, careful omissions, buried resentment, but none had yet tripped fully over a lie. Poirot adjusted the cuffs of his shirt as he moved again through the west corridor. Every movement was deliberate, as if the alignment of his wardrobe might somehow tilt the balance of truth. The storm of silence around the murder had begun to settle into brittle routine. Constables stationed, guests whispering behind teacups, and Lady Eugenia pretending with crisp dignity that murder was not an unwelcome guest in her home. It was time, Poirot thought, to speak with the girl. Clara Haskett received him in the solarium. She sat curled in a wicker chair, a cashmere shawl drawn around her pale shoulders, her expression distant. The light from the window gilded her hair in muted gold. She reminded Poirot of a figure trapped behind glass, present but unreachable. "Miss Haskett," he said gently, bowing his head as he approached. "I thank you for receiving me." She nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. "You have suffered loss recently, I understand." Another small nod. "My mother," she whispered. "Last spring." "I am sorry," Poirot said. "Grief, mademoiselle, is not unlike fog. It distorts and isolates, and sometimes it reveals." She looked at him then, properly. "Reveals?" Poirot's voice dropped. "You saw something. The night Mr. Vale died." Her hands clutched the shawl more tightly, fingers white at the knuckles. "It wasn't just me," she murmured. "Others joked about it, but I saw it. I know I did." "The portrait," Poirot said gently. "You believe it blinked?" "I don't believe, Monsieur Poirot. I saw it, just once. I was in the drawing-room after dinner. Everyone had gone to fetch coffee. I was alone, and I looked up. The Admiral's eyes, they were closed, just for a moment. And then they opened again. She trembled, but did not cry. I thought I'd imagined it. But then I told Sebastian. And what did he say? That I wasn't mad. He'd seen it too, and that he thought it was someone's trick, or a message." Poirot's gaze sharpened slightly. "A message?" She nodded. "He said something awful had happened here. Years ago. Something that hadn't been spoken of since. He said the Admiral hated secrets. That if the eyes blinked, it meant someone had broken an oath." Poirot remained silent for a moment, letting the thought settle. "Mademoiselle," he said at last, "you did very well to tell me. There is one final thing I must ask. Did you hear or see anything else that evening?" Clara hesitated. Then, in a whisper, "Yes, after everyone went to bed. I couldn't sleep. I came down for a glass of water. I passed the study. The door was ajar, and I heard someone speaking inside." "Speaking? To whom?" "I don't know. It was a man's voice, but no one answered him." Poirot leaned forward. "Can you recall what he said?" She shut her eyes. "Just one line. I remember it clearly because it frightened me. He said, 'You can stop watching now, Bertram. I've already told them your secret.'" Poirot's gaze flicked toward the window, where the branches of a leafless birch scratched against the glass like a pen on paper. When he returned to the main corridor, Hastings met him halfway, cheeks ruddy from the autumn chill. "Well," Hastings said, lowering his voice, "do you truly believe this nonsense about blinking portraits, Poirot?" Poirot gave him a look both indulgent and amused. "Mon ami, I do not believe in haunted paintings, but I do believe in haunted people. And that, I suspect, is what we are dealing with." But why would Vale write that as his final message? Not a name, not a location or clue. Because, Poirot said, he had already told someone everything he knew. The message he left was not meant to identify his killer. It was meant to expose the lie that cost him his life. The sound of voices rose from the drawing room. Lady Eugenia was holding a second gathering, this time in the name of dignity and routine. But Poirot could already see the unease in each guest's eyes as they passed through the corridor. They had not expected him, and certainly not so soon. That was always the first mistake. Assuming Hercule Poirot required time to become dangerous. He required only truth, and a single inconsistency to pull the whole tapestry apart. Before joining the others, Poirot turned and gazed once more at the portrait. Admiral Hargrove, dead these many years, stared back with resolute authority, one hand on the telescope, one hand curled, unfinished. That gesture had not been a salute. It had been a warning, and someone had understood it all too well. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The drawing room had returned to its polished, silent formality by late afternoon, though the air within it felt altered. The guests now moved with a noticeable stiffness, gestures too controlled, eyes that shifted too quickly. The polished surface of civility remained, but beneath it, something volatile simmered. Poirot sat beside a low marble table, hands steepled beneath his chin. On the table sat a thin leather folio, closed beside a single sheet of cream notepaper bearing only 3 typed lines, a list of names. Lady Eugenia Hargrove, Dr. Alaric Finch, Viscountess Lily Breton. The names were unnumbered, unordered, but weighted. Poirot did not ask Hastings to remain. He preferred solitude when beginning the delicate dance of interviews. One voice at a time, one mask to be studied, peeled back, discarded. The first to enter was Lady Eugenia herself. She sat upright, unyielding as carved oak, her cane resting against the chair's arm. The firelight gave her eyes a golden edge. "I trust you find progress in your inquiries, Monsieur Poirot," she said dryly. Poirot inclined his head. "Progress, madame, often begins not with the loud declaration, but with the quiet contradiction." She allowed a faint, unreadable smile. "Ask what you must. You invited Sebastian Vale, despite your personal disdain for his writings." "I did not invite him," she said. "He invited himself. He was a parasite of reputation. He knew his presence made others uncomfortable. He enjoyed that. And yet, he was not turned away. I do not turn away guests once they cross my threshold, Monsieur Poirot. We are not barbarians." Poirot leaned forward. "And what of your history with him, madame? He insulted your family publicly on several occasions. Called your late husband an ornament of obsolete warfare." She met his gaze steadily. "Yes, and I let it pass." "No bitterness?" "Oh, plenty," she said with the ghost of a smirk. "But bitterness is like expensive perfume. It lingers without needing to be flaunted." Poirot studied her. "Did you speak to him the evening of his death?" "Briefly. I asked him not to disturb the guests. He made a joke about portraits with too much presence. And then he left the room." She paused. "May I ask, Monsieur Poirot, what you think of the portrait?" Poirot glanced toward the hallway beyond. "I think it is like its subject. Watchful, proud, and silent." Lady Eugenia rose without further comment. Then perhaps it sees more than we do. When she had left, Poirot allowed the pause to stretch. He did not yet know if she was protecting herself or someone else. Next came Dr. Finch. He entered with an academic's calm, carrying a notebook and stroking the bridge of his spectacles with one precise finger. "You've made quite an impression, Poirot. The house is abuzz." Poirot did not smile. "Dr. Finch, I would appreciate your clarity. Do you know anything of a secret between Sebastian Vale and Admiral Hargrove?" Finch blinked, visibly surprised. "Not particularly. The Admiral kept his past close. Vale once joked that he'd dig something up, but I assumed he meant professionally. Something naval, perhaps. You believe Vale was researching Admiral Hargrove. I know he requested access to some of the Admiral's journals last year, which Lady Eugenia declined." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Did you know of this, Madame?" he asked the room aloud, though Lady Eugenia had already gone. Dr. Finch looked around awkwardly. "I assumed it was private correspondence." "And did he mention the journals again?" "Not explicitly, but he was unusually agitated this week, jumpy, distracted." Poirot nodded slowly. "And you spoke of Clara Haskett as fragile. Why?" Finch exhaled. "She is unwell, deeply internal, possibly suffering from grief-induced hallucinations. I offered to evaluate her. Her father refused." "Did she ever speak to you of the portrait?" Finch hesitated. "No." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You are certain?" A pause. "She may have mentioned a movement." I didn't press. I believed it to be symbolic. And yet others overheard her telling Vale about it. Surely you understand, Doctor, that withholding such a conversation, however brief, impedes my inquiry. Finch's fingers curled tighter around his notebook. "Perhaps I misjudged its significance. Or perhaps," Poirot said mildly, "you feared where it might lead." The doctor stiffened but said nothing further. He left without waiting to be dismissed. Poirot leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. Two conversations. Two people who wore restraint like armor, and yet beneath both, a curious heat of fear or guilt. The third guest to arrive was Viscountess Lily Breton. Her demeanor was changed now, less theatrical, more cautious. She wore navy, her veil lifted, her hair pinned in a loose twist. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, settling onto the divan, "shall we get on with it?" "Of course. I ask only what I must." "Then ask about the portrait and be done with it." "Yes, I saw something. A trick of the light, a twitch in the paint, and yes, it chilled me." "You saw it blink?" She looked down. I thought I did. Only for a second." "And did you tell anyone?" She shook her head. "Sebastian told me. He said it wasn't a blink but a threat. That someone here was hiding something the Admiral hated." Poirot nodded. "And how did that make you feel?" "Foolish. Like I was part of some childish séance. But then he dared me to say something. Said I was always too careful to speak the truth." "And were you?" Lily's lips pressed into a line. "Sebastian knew too much. He always did." "And did you ever love him?" Her eyes snapped to his, wide and wounded. "That's hardly relevant." "On the contrary," Poirot said softly. "Love or its absence always leaves fingerprints." She rose abruptly. "You think you know everything." "No, madame. I merely listen until people tell me everything they think I missed." She left the room without another word. Poirot stood and walked to the fireplace once more. The portrait loomed above, silent, proud, and still. But its shadow had lengthened. 3 interviews, 3 masks. But someone was lying, and Poirot, ever patient, would wait for the contradiction that cracked the veneer. Chapter 6. The First False Lead. The rain arrived just past midnight, tapping against the tall windows of Finchley like an impatient visitor denied entry. Poirot sat in the drawing-room alone, the low fire dwindling, his thoughts weaving in and out of the day's conversations like smoke from a snuffed-out candle. Lady Eugenia had hidden more than pride behind her silence. Dr. Finch was too eager to dismiss Clara Haskett's fears. And Viscountess Breton, her polished grief was curiously rehearsed. But it was not until Foster, the butler, approached with a nervous glint in his eye, that Poirot sensed the tempo of the case would shift. "Sir," Foster said, clearing his throat, "I thought you might want to know. Inspector Mallory has returned. He's in the study." Poirot raised a brow. "At this hour?" "He said he's come to make an arrest." Poirot stood at once. "Then he moves too quickly." The study was warm with gaslight. Mallory stood beside the Admiral's desk, arms crossed. A file folder clutched to his side like a trophy. His mouth curled into a smirk when he saw Poirot enter. "Thought you'd like to be present for this, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot remained perfectly still. "What have you discovered, Inspector?" "We've completed our fingerprint analysis of the display case. The pistol was handled recently, very recently. Only 2 sets of prints, the deceased's and one other." Mallory opened the folder with the flourish of a magician revealing a rabbit. "Dr. Vive, Alaric Finch." Poirot remained silent, absorbing this. The inspector continued, his tone triumphant. "And that's not all. We retrieved a second page from the deceased's notebook, folded between others, dated the day before his death." He read aloud. "Finch warned me off, told me not to bring it up again. Said some stories deserve to die with the dead. He's more afraid than he lets on." "Sounds like motive to me," Mallory finished. Poirot's gaze narrowed. "Indeed. And what does Dr. Finch say to this?" "He says he touched the case while inspecting the room after the body was removed. Believable, perhaps, until we found this." Mallory held up a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a bullet casing, tarnished, marked by 2 shallow grooves. "Hidden behind the curtain near the fireplace," Mallory said. "We believe it was ejected from the Admiral's pistol. The slug is still missing, but the casing puts the weapon in use that night." Poirot stepped forward. "And what caliber?" "38, same as the Admiral's service weapon." "And the time of death?" "Between 9 and 9:30, likely instantaneous. Vale's body showed no signs of a struggle. Whoever fired that shot was close, precise, and not in a hurry to flee." Poirot considered this in silence. A clean execution in a room with 1 door and a silent witness. The portrait. "You're not convinced," Mallory said. "I am intrigued," Poirot replied. "But no, Inspector, I'm not convinced." Mallory scoffed. "He's the only one with a known disagreement, a motive, a physical link to the weapon." "And yet, Inspector," Poirot said gently, "consider the theatre of it. A gun once owned by the Admiral. A portrait said to blink. A dying man who leaves a cryptic message, not a name." He paused. If Dr. Finch were clever enough to commit the crime, would he truly be so clumsy as to leave his fingerprints untouched? On a glass case? Mallory's expression soured. "Are you suggesting the prints were planted?" "I suggest," Poirot said, "that they were left, which is not the same thing." Before Mallory could answer, the door opened. It was Hastings. "Poirot," he said quietly. "Clara Haskett. She's missing." The house was in quiet turmoil. Guests whispered in the halls, and Lady Eugenia stood at the top of the staircase like a monument to control fraying at the edges. Poirot followed Foster swiftly toward the guest wing, where a door stood ajar. Clara's room was dim, her bed untouched. The window was open. A single damp footprint stained the wooden floorboards, fading into the carpet beyond. On the desk was an envelope. Poirot opened it gently. Inside was a folded sheet of hotel stationery, blank save for 1 line, written in delicate, hesitant script. I know what they did, but I don't want to remember." Below it, unsigned, was a penciled address. Bellwether Manor, Hollowgate. Poirot read it twice, then once more. "She left this voluntarily," he murmured. "No struggle, no haste." Hastings frowned. "But why leave now?" "Because," Poirot said softly, "someone convinced her the memory was worse than the truth." He stared at the line again. "I know what they did." Poirot turned to Hastings. "We must find her, and fast, for I believe someone else knows what she saw." "Finch?" "No," Poirot said. "I believe Dr. Finch is guilty, but not of murder. I believe he's guilty of fear." He turned toward the staircase. "And fear, my friend, is not a crime, unless it leads one to silence the truth." Outside, the wind picked up, and within Finchley, the portrait watched on. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. It was well past dawn when Poirot and Hastings arrived at Bellwether Manor. A cold mist clung to the ground like old grief, curling around wrought iron fences and soaking into the ivy that strangled the neglected gateposts. The house itself was smaller than Finchley, but bore the unmistakable weight of wealth gone quietly to seed. The gravel crunched beneath their shoes as they approached the front door, which was already ajar, the brass handle slick with dew. Poirot paused at the threshold, as if listening to the silence within. Hastings glanced at him, uncertain, but Poirot gave the faintest nod and stepped inside. Clara Haskett sat in the conservatory, knees drawn to her chest, wrapped in a blanket as though it were the last defense between herself and some old, remembered horror. Her eyes were glassy, but when she saw Poirot, something like recognition flickered across her face. Not relief, not fear, but a weary expectation. She said nothing as he approached, nor did she flinch when he drew a chair close beside her. The room smelled faintly of rosemary and dust, as if someone had tried, half-heartedly, to erase the past with herbs and thyme. A single cup of untouched tea sat on the small table beside her, steam long since faded into the cold morning air. "Clara," Poirot began gently, folding his hands, "you have run, yes, but not to escape danger. You have come here to escape memory." She blinked slowly, her lips parting, but no words came. He continued, "Your note said, 'I don't want to remember.' That means you do remember, at least enough to fear what it will do to you if it returns." Her shoulders trembled, but still she said nothing. Poirot did not press. He reached instead into his coat and withdrew a small object wrapped in a white handkerchief. It was the page from Sebastian Vale's notebook, the one found in his lifeless hand. He laid it before her, her eyes fixed on it. "You gave him something, mademoiselle," Poirot said softly. "Something important. Something he believed would expose a secret hidden long ago in the walls of Finchley." Clara's lower lip trembled. Poirot leaned slightly forward, his voice warm but firm. "If you stay silent, you will be helping someone hide a truth that may kill again. You do not want that." At last she spoke, barely a whisper. "It was just a story. I heard it when I was small, and I thought it was nonsense, until he said it matched something he found." Poirot's eyes narrowed gently. "What story?" She hesitated. "My mother used to whisper it to me, late at night when I couldn't sleep. She worked at Finchley when she was young, before she met my father. She said there was a room that no one opened, a room the Admiral ordered sealed after someone died there. A servant, I think. But my mother, she always hinted it wasn't just a servant." Her voice faltered, and Poirot gave her time. "She said the Admiral made everyone swear to silence, that something had been done, something cruel. She never said what exactly. But she hated the house. She refused to ever return, even when Lady Eugenia invited her. And when she got sick, she made me promise never to go near the West Wing." There was a long pause. Poirot's face remained unreadable, though his mind raced. And Sebastian Vale, he discovered this story through you? Clara nodded. I told him the story once, just a whisper. I didn't think he believed me, but then he started asking questions. He told me he found something, a letter maybe. I don't know. He said it would change everything if it were true. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And then, mademoiselle, he died. Clara closed her eyes. He said someone knew he was getting close. He said the Admiral's portrait wasn't what was watching us. It was the people still alive who feared what the Admiral might have revealed. Back at Finchley, the guests gathered again that afternoon under strained civility. Word of Clara's disappearance and Poirot's pursuit had spread. Dr. Finch sat near the fireplace, flipping pages of a medical journal but reading none. Viscountess Breton sipped at her tea with forced poise, her gloved fingers trembling just slightly. Poirot entered quietly, glanced at the assembled faces, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, with a precise nod, he approached Dr. Finch. I must thank you, Doctor, he said politely. You are right to be afraid. Finch looked up sharply, startled. Afraid? Poirot smiled calmly. You feared what Sebastian Vale had found. Not because you were guilty, but because you remembered what had been forgotten, just as Clara remembered what she had been told to forget. You were at Finchley as a young man, were you not? Finch swallowed. I did visit often. My father was the Admiral's physician. Of course, Poirot said smoothly. And so you would have known about the sealed room, the one no one discussed. The room seemed to grow colder. Lady Eugenia turned sharply. That's a family matter, she said stiffly. Poirot turned to her. No, madame. That is a murder matter. He turned back to Finch. And that is why you lied about Clara's mention of the portrait. You feared she would lead someone to remember, but you did not kill. No, you simply obeyed an old fear, one passed down from those who witnessed something dark in this house. Dr. Finch stood, tense and shaken. I didn't kill him. I swear it. Poirot nodded. I believe you. He turned now to the rest of the room, his voice cutting through the silence like the toll of a bell. But someone in this house feared the past far more than the present, and that fear has turned to something more dangerous still. Desperation. As he turned from the fireplace, Poirot's gaze lingered once more on the portrait above the mantel. The Admiral's expression had not changed, but the shadows around his eyes seemed deeper now, as if the paint itself had begun to mourn. The psychological game had begun, not to trick the murderer, but to draw them out. Let them feel the breath of truth at their neck. Let them begin to sweat. Let them, in time, reveal themselves not through what they said, but through what they could no longer hide. Chapter 8. A Secondary Mystery. The rain had returned by evening, soft, rhythmic, and unrelenting. It whispered against the leaded windows of Finchley House, drumming a slow dirge across the stone terrace and dripping from the eaves like the ticking of an invisible clock. The mood inside the house had shifted subtly, as if something beneath the surface had cracked. Though no one said it aloud, they all felt it. Poirot's presence was no longer merely investigative. It had become confrontational. He had begun to see beneath the masks, and now the guests were guarding themselves as if preparing for war. Poirot sat in the library, its walls lined with naval records, war dispatches, and faded maritime maps. He studied a cluster of documents retrieved from the estate's archives, mostly irrelevant letters, signed invitations, naval commendations. But something troubled him. There was a gap in the Admiral's personal journals. A full year missing. Hastings entered quietly, shaking off his umbrella, his coat glistening with raindrops. Anything? He asked. Poirot did not look up. No, mon ami, and that is precisely the problem. There is too little. The Admiral, a man of detail, precision. He kept meticulous records, but there is nothing from the winter of 1917. A vanished year. Before Hastings could reply, a sharp knock echoed from the hallway. Foster appeared in the doorway, breathless and pale. "Sir, Lady Eugenia has summoned you. There's been another incident." "In the drawing room." Poirot rose at once. "Another death?" "No, sir, but perhaps something worse." The drawing room, when they arrived, was filled with a hush so complete it felt unnatural. Lady Eugenia stood by the fireplace, holding something in her hand. Viscountess Breton and Dr. Finch hovered nearby, their expressions dark with confusion. On the table in the center of the room, laid out neatly atop a sheet of linen, was a folded letter, a small tin of sealing wax, and a white envelope bearing the Admiral's monogram. Poirot stepped forward, his gaze sharp. "What is this?" Lady Eugenia's voice trembled just slightly. "It was found, tucked behind the baseboard of the Admiral's study, behind the display case." She handed the folded paper to Poirot. He opened it with care. The handwriting was unmistakably the Admiral's. Neat, angular, with an almost military restraint. It was addressed to be opened in the event of betrayal. The message within was short. "If this letter has been discovered, then the vow has been broken. They will try to erase what was done, but it cannot be erased. The truth is buried not in the earth, but in the silence. I leave this as a warning. The guilt belongs not to the dead, but to those who speak in half-truths." The room held its breath. "What does it mean?" Finch asked. Poirot folded the letter carefully. "It means the Admiral feared more than gossip. He feared legacy. This is not merely about a murder, Doctor. It is about a long-held oath of silence, one that Vale may have broken." Lady Eugenia sat slowly, her usual composure slipping. "That letter has been hidden for years. I never knew of it." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Or perhaps, Madame, you knew something was hidden, but you chose never to look closely. It is easy to miss what we do not wish to see." Viscountess Breton looked shaken. "This is absurd. Are you saying someone killed Vale to protect a secret from decades ago? That seems theatrical, even for Finchley." Poirot glanced at her. "And yet theatricality seems to run in this house. Ghostly portraits, vanishing journals, whispered warnings from the grave. But no, Madame, this is not theatre. It is desperation disguised as ritual. A man was killed to protect an illusion that is now crumbling." Just then, Foster returned once more, this time with a sealed evidence bag in his gloved hands. "Found in the Viscountess's room, sir, in the drawer beneath her travel case." Inside the bag was a second red notebook, identical in size to Vale's. Poirot took it, opened it carefully, and scanned the pages. His face remained impassive, but Hastings saw a flicker in his eyes. "What is it?" Hastings asked. Poirot turned a page. Notes. Drafts of an article Vale was preparing. He never submitted it, perhaps because it was unfinished, perhaps because he was killed before he could. He read aloud. "The Hargrove estate and the vanishing servant, the unspoken burial beneath British grace." There was a long pause. Poirot looked up. He knew. Lady Eugenia stood. "This is an invasion. That notebook is not evidence of anything." Poirot's voice sharpened. "On the contrary, Madame, it is evidence of motive. Someone here knew that Vale was about to publish a scandal that would tarnish the Hargrove name, and perhaps implicate others." He turned to the Viscountess. "And you, Madame, had the notebook. Why?" Lily Breton's lips thinned. "He gave it to me," she said coldly, "the night before he died. He said it would protect him, that if something happened to him I was to deliver it to the press." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And yet you did not." "Because I didn't believe him," she snapped. "I thought it was just another one of his games, another dig at Lady Eugenia. I didn't think he'd actually—" Her voice trailed off. Poirot closed the notebook. "Then perhaps, Madame, You too were afraid. Not of the secret itself, but of what it would mean for you, for your position, your friends, your inheritance. She said nothing. Poirot turned to Hastings. Tell Foster to secure this room and instruct the constable to seal off the study. There is something else hidden there, I am certain of it. Something Vale nearly found. Something that someone else already knew existed. He looked once more at the fireplace, then at the portrait above it. This house is not just the scene of a crime, Hastings. It is the crime itself, layered in silence, framed by guilt, and preserved beneath paint and pride. We must go deeper now, and quickly, before the next truth is buried. Like the last. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. That night, Poirot did not sleep. He sat in the west-facing window of his guest room, arms crossed tightly, the rain-streaked glass casting ghostly reflections of the room behind him. Below, the estate was draped in fog, the gardens swallowed in grey. Finchley had become something close to a mausoleum, quiet, sealed, and full of the unspoken. There was a rhythm to such mysteries, Poirot knew. The moment before the final unraveling was always the most dangerous. That was when people made mistakes. When their fear turned frantic, when old allegiances shattered like glass. At dawn, Poirot requested Foster accompany him once more to the study. The room, now sealed by police order, remained untouched. The same books lined the shelves. The Admiral's chair sat resolute behind the desk, and above all loomed the ever-watchful portrait. But Poirot wasn't looking at the obvious anymore. He paced slowly around the perimeter of the room, tapping lightly on the wooden paneling, pausing at the floorboards, kneeling to examine the faintest imperfections in the carpet. Foster stood quietly, clearly unnerved. You believe there's something physical hidden, monsieur? Poirot didn't answer directly. He lifted the edge of the large Turkish rug, exposing a seam in the floor, a narrow, jagged crack, previously hidden by the carpet's border. It stretched just a few inches, but continued beneath the display cabinet. With Foster's help, Poirot shifted the cabinet carefully aside. Beneath it was a brass ring sunk into the wood, a hidden compartment. With gloved hands, Poirot pulled it open. The scent that emerged was old, dry air, parchment, and something faintly acidic. Inside the hollow space, barely large enough for a stack of books, lay a single wooden box, latched shut. Poirot opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, yellowed, curled at the edges, some torn, black and white images of the estate from decades ago, one of the West Wing under construction, another of the staff lined up for a group portrait, and beneath them a letter addressed to Bertram Hargrove. Private. Poirot unfolded the letter. The handwriting was different from the Admiral's. It was softer, less rigid. A woman's hand. You swore we would protect her, that the child would be given a life free from shame. I kept my silence because I believed in your word, but now you are letting him remain on this land, this house, as if nothing happened. I can bear it no longer. I will leave by morning. If the girl ever comes back, she must never know the truth. Poirot read the letter again. The ink had bled at the corners, perhaps from tears or time. There was no signature. This, Poirot said quietly, is no longer simply about murder. It is about legacy and erasure. He looked up at Foster. How long have you worked here, monsieur? 38 years, sir. Then you remember the staff from the Admiral's time? Foster hesitated. Yes, sir, most of them, though I was very young when I started. Poirot laid the staff photograph on the desk. Do you recognize this woman? He pointed to a young maid standing at the edge of the lineup, her posture timid, her face turned slightly away from the lens. Foster leaned in. I believe that's Maeve. Maeve Holloway. She was quiet, kept to herself. What happened to her? She left, or... He paused. That's what we were told. I never saw her go. One day she simply wasn't on the roster. Poirot nodded slowly. And was she involved with the Admiral? Foster's face tensed. There were rumors, but no one dared speak of such things in this house. Poirot placed the letter and photo back in the box. "Prepare a fire in the drawing room," he said. "Not to burn this, but to light what has been kept in darkness for far too long." By mid-morning, Poirot had summoned all the guests: Lady Eugenia, Dr. Finch, Viscountess Breton, Henry Haskett, and even Clara, who had been gently escorted back to Finchley earlier that morning by Hastings. They gathered uneasily in the drawing room, the fire crackling behind them, its glow casting shifting shadows against the Admiral's portrait. Poirot did not begin with accusations. He began with history. "Decades ago," he said, voice calm but piercing, "a servant disappeared from this house. Her name was Maeve Holloway. The official story was that she left of her own will, but that was a lie. A carefully preserved one. She was involved with Admiral Hargrove. Whether consensually or not, we do not know, but a child was conceived. The Admiral, determined to protect his name and marriage, arranged for her silence and her removal." Gasps rippled through the room. Lady Eugenia looked stunned but said nothing. Clara's face had gone white. Poirot turned slowly to Haskett. "And you, sir, Henry Haskett. That name is not the one you were born with, is it?" Haskett's jaw tightened. But he didn't respond. Poirot nodded. "Maeve Holloway had a brother, a younger brother, who left England and settled in America. Your father. You came here not just for your daughter's health. You came here because your family had been bound to this place by silence and shame." Haskett swallowed. "I didn't know all of it, only pieces. My mother, she died young. My father never spoke of his sister. But I found an old letter, and then another. They led me back here." Poirot stepped forward. "And Clara?" There was a pause. Then Haskett spoke. "She's not just my daughter. She's Maeve's granddaughter." A stunned silence followed. Lady Eugenia finally spoke, her voice brittle. "You brought her here, knowing what this house did to her family." "I brought her here," Haskett said, eyes flashing, "because I wanted answers. She was hearing whispers in her sleep. She said the walls spoke. I didn't believe it until I found the records. I wanted her to know the truth." Poirot turned now to the others. Sebastian Vale uncovered fragments of this story, enough to threaten the legacy of Finchley, enough to rattle those who feared disgrace, and someone decided that silence was safer than truth. His eyes scanned the room slowly. "This is no longer merely about a murder. It is about betrayal, of promises made, of oaths taken, and someone among you was willing to kill to keep the past buried." No one moved. The fire hissed. The portrait loomed. Poirot stepped back and folded his hands. "But the past, mes amis, it does not stay buried, not when it is carved into silence, not when a portrait watches, and not when guilt begins to speak." Chapter 10. Poirot's Secret Clue. As the firelight dimmed to a low, pulsing glow and the storm continued to press against the windows like a restless ghost, Hercule Poirot retired to the quiet of the Admiral's study. He closed the door behind him gently, allowing the hush to return, as if the house itself needed a moment to breathe. In his hand, he held a small object, easily dismissed, easily overlooked. A button, not a new one, not shiny or ornamental, but one of thick black horn, matte from wear. It had been found wedged deep in the baseboard gap behind the cabinet, near the hidden floor compartment. Not far from where Sebastian Vale had likely stood, perhaps only minutes before his death. He had not shown it to Inspector Mallory. Not yet. It was, as Poirot referred to such things in his mind, un indice secret, a private clue. something to be held back until the theatre of the truth was ready for its final act. Poirot turned the button slowly between his fingers. It was faintly scratched, but unmistakably old-fashioned, of a type used in naval uniforms. Not from the Admiral's displayed coat, which remained untouched under glass, but from another source. Another uniform. Perhaps one never officially issued. Or perhaps one hidden away, kept for memory, or misdirection. He set the button gently on the desk and returned his attention to the letter he'd retrieved earlier from the hidden compartment. The woman who had written it had spoken of betrayal, of a vow broken. Her words had been tired, bitter, but clear. And above all else, they matched the tone Poirot had observed throughout this house, that of people who lived with secrets, not comfortably, but as though they were dragging weights through time. And now, with Vale's murder, that weight had shifted. Someone had panicked. Someone had realized that the story Maeve Holloway once tried to silence had found its way back into the walls of Finchley. There came a knock, soft but insistent. Poirot opened the door to find Hastings, his coat damp, his brow furrowed with a quiet urgency. "I thought you should know," Hastings said, stepping inside. "Inspector Mallory is planning to make an arrest. He believes the evidence against Viscountess Breton is conclusive. Motive, access, and now the hidden notebook." Poirot raised a brow. "Does he?" His voice was even. "Then perhaps we must be quick." "Quick about what?" Poirot turned, gesturing toward the desk. "Tell me, Hastings, do you recall the storm that struck during the night Vale was killed?" "Of course. It came in fast, didn't it?" "Exactly. Fast and loud. Thunder, wind. Enough noise to mask a gunshot." Hastings narrowed his eyes. "You think the murderer used the storm to cover the sound?" Poirot gave a slow nod. "Yes, but not just that. The room was carefully staged, the body placed in the chair, the note arranged just so. But the gun, the Admiral's pistol, was never recovered. If the killer had acted on impulse, they might have dropped or hidden it nearby. But no, it vanished, which means they planned the killing. And more importantly, they had time after the act to remove the weapon entirely." Hastings rubbed his chin. "But surely that implicates someone inside the house, a guest who knew the layout, the hidden compartments." "Indeed," Poirot murmured. "But more than that, it implicates someone who knew when Vale would be alone." He paced slowly toward the window. The rain had turned to mist now, falling soft and silver. Poirot's eyes traced the outline of the gardens below, then settled again on the portrait over the fireplace. "Do you know, mon ami," he said softly, "I have begun to think of that painting as more than decoration. It has become a symbol, a sentinel. It does not blink, of course. It does not move, but it sees, and, more importantly, it was seen." Hastings frowned. "Seen by Vale, by Clara?" "By all of them," Poirot said, "because they needed something to carry their guilt. The portrait became their scapegoat, their mask. The Admiral, cold and watching, allowed them to displace their shame. But shame, Hastings, does not rest. It festers." And eventually, someone broke. Hastings sat down slowly. "So you believe the murder was the culmination, not of one secret, but of years of silent pressure?" "Exactly." Poirot lifted the button again. "And this is the hinge, the key that turns the lock. Whoever lost this was in that room during the murder. The size, the style. It does not belong to the staff or to Vale. It matches a naval replica uniform, decorative, out of place, unless—" A sharp crack of thunder interrupted him. Poirot stilled, then smiled. "Ah, listen, it returns. Nature repeats. But men forget. And in forgetting, they reveal themselves." There was a sudden knock again, more hurried this time. Foster's voice came muffled from the other side. "Monsieur Poirot, Lady Eugenia requests your presence, urgently. Something's happened. Poirot nodded to Hastings. "Come, my friend. It begins." They followed Foster through the hallway and down the stairs. The guests were assembled once more in the great drawing-room, though this time not with resistance but with a silent anticipation. Something in the air had shifted, as if they sensed Poirot had crossed an invisible threshold in the mystery. Lady Eugenia stood by the fireplace, her face pale, her hands trembling. She held something in a lace handkerchief, a piece of paper folded once. Poirot approached. "What is it, madame?" She handed it to him. "I found it slid beneath my door this morning. It's not addressed, but I know the handwriting. It's Vale's." Poirot unfolded the note. It was brief. 4 words, scrawled in the same ink as the other notebook entries. "The guilt is hers." The room fell into silence. Hastings glanced at Poirot. "Another clue?" Poirot shook his head slowly. "No, Hastings, not a clue. A trap. Someone is trying to push the blame once more, before I can reveal what they fear most." He folded the note and looked around at the guests, their faces a mixture of fear, fatigue, and fierce curiosity. "Let them look," he said quietly to Hastings. "Because soon the last mask will fall, and when it does, it will not be the portrait that blinks. It will be the murderer, caught at last in the gaze of the truth." Chapter 11. Tensions rise. The drawing-room pulsed with a strange, thick stillness. Though the fire crackled and daylight trickled through the gauzy curtains, no warmth reached the faces gathered there. Lady Eugenia stood apart from the rest, her fingers still trembling slightly despite her usual poise. Dr. Finch sat rigid in the corner, his knees close together, eyes narrowed with something between worry and calculation. Viscountess Breton paced in slow, shallow circles, and Clara Heskett, pale and watching, sat with hands folded tightly in her lap. It was a room of suspects who no longer trusted one another, and who were beginning to feel that Poirot, silent and poised by the hearth, knew far more than he let on. Poirot turned the folded slip of paper over in his hand. The note left under Lady Eugenia's door. 4 words, "The guilt is hers." It was the kind of note that could ignite panic in a house already sagging under secrets. But he had seen this tactic before, the pressure mounting, the cracks widening, a desperate bid to redirect suspicion at the last moment. The note, he thought, was not a confession. It was fear made manifest. Someone in this room wanted Lady Eugenia to break first. "I must ask you all," Poirot said quietly, "to remain at Finchley. No more letters slipped under doors, no more private messages or misdirection. The investigation nears its end, and the murderer, le meurtrier, knows this. That is why they now lash out." The accusation hung in the air like thunder waiting to fall. Dr. Finch stood abruptly. "I demand to know what evidence you have, Monsieur Poirot. You speak in riddles, but none of us have been formally charged." "No, Doctor," Poirot said calmly. "You demand a truth not to free yourself, but to weigh whether it is safe to speak. You, like the others, know more than you have admitted. But the time for silence ends now." Lady Eugenia's voice, suddenly sharp, cut across the room. "Are you accusing me, Monsieur Poirot? After all I've done to preserve this house, this legacy?" Poirot turned to her slowly. "I accuse no one, not yet, but I observe, and I listen. The walls of Finchley speak now, madame. Not through ghosts or blinking portraits, but through memory and through the lies people tell when memory becomes too difficult to bear." There was movement at the door. Hastings entered, holding a sheaf of old documents, his expression unreadable. "I found something," he said, stepping forward. "In the estate storage room, behind a stack of forgotten trunks. It's a ledger. Staff wages, medical expenses, repairs, everything kept by the Admiral's steward in the early 1920s. He handed the book to Poirot, who flipped it open carefully. His eyes scanned the entries until he found what he was looking for. March 3rd, 1922, Poirot read aloud. Payment to private physician, overnight, unrecorded. Then again, April 19th, 1922, wages terminated. Holloway M. Lady Eugenia's face had gone white. That was the year, Poirot said softly. The missing journal, the servant who vanished. The secret Maeve carried to her grave, and here, now, the paper trail someone hoped would remain buried beneath the dust of this house. Dr. Finch's jaw worked. I never knew about this. I swear it. And yet your father was the Admiral's physician, Poirot replied, eyes narrowing. You inherited not just his name, Doctor, but his proximity to this house. You may not have committed the crime, but you inherited the silence. Viscountess Breton suddenly snapped, her voice rising. And what about her? She pointed directly at Clara, the fragile little thing who hears whispers and sees blinking portraits. Why are we taking her word for anything? Clara flinched, but Poirot stepped between them. Because truth reveals itself in fear, madame, not in performance, and of all those gathered here, it is Clara who has consistently shown fear untainted by motive. Clara rose slowly. Her voice was soft but steady. I heard someone the night Sebastian died. A voice, male, angry. He said, "You always were reckless. Now you've forced my hand." Poirot turned to the room, and there it is, the heart of the crime, not the portrait, not the letter, but that phrase, "You've forced my hand." Dr. Finch sank back into his chair. Lady Eugenia sat in stunned silence. But Henry Haskett, who had said little since returning to the house, now stepped forward with slow, deliberate movements. "I've heard that phrase before," he said. "Years ago, in a letter addressed to my father. It was unsigned, but it spoke of disgrace and how Maeve had ruined everything." He looked at Lady Eugenia. "He thought it was from your husband." For a long, brittle moment, no one spoke. Then Lady Eugenia's eyes dropped, her lips tightening. "It was," she said finally. "But it wasn't just Bertram's anger. It was mine, too. I wrote the words, I just used his voice." Poirot closed the ledger and set it gently on the table. "You see now," he said, voice low, "why the guilt in this house does not belong to one person. The past was broken by many hands, but only one chose to kill in the present." His gaze swept the room. "And I know who it was." The room froze. "But not yet," Poirot said, turning toward the door. "The truth deserves its own stage, and tomorrow it shall have one." He left the drawing room without another word, letting the tension hang behind him like the echo of a bell that had not quite stopped ringing. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The next morning dawned grey and brittle, as if even the weather had grown tired of deception. Finchley House stood quiet beneath the low clouds, its windows still beaded with the mist of night. No birds sang. The gravel paths were undisturbed, and yet, within its halls, tension surged like a current waiting to snap. Hercule Poirot had requested a private gathering in the Admiral's study, not the drawing room, not the library, but the very space where Sebastian Vale had died. It was, Poirot insisted, the place most suited for clarity, for it was in this room that lies had begun, and here, at last, they would end. One by one, they arrived. Clara, her eyes downcast but clear, clutching her shawl with both hands. Viscountess Breton, sharp-jawed and silent, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Dr. Finch, pale and twitching at the collar, as if still wondering whether he had more to confess. Henry Haskett came last, with an expression not of defiance, but of resignation, as though he had come to bear witness to something long expected. Lady Eugenia arrived alone, her cane clicking against the oak floor, and took her place beside the fireplace beneath the Admiral's watchful gaze. Poirot stood near the desk, where the sunlight fell through high windows in a single muted beam. He looked not at them, but at the floor. His hands were clasped behind his back. "Merci," he said at last. "You are here because you are all pieces of a story that was hidden for decades. You did not create the story, perhaps, but you inherited it, and one of you chose to keep it hidden by the oldest method of all: murder." He turned slowly to face them. Sebastian Vale died not because he was cruel or arrogant or reckless. He died because he uncovered something that had been buried, literally and figuratively. He found the letters, he connected the dates, and he found out what happened in this very house in the spring of 1922. Poirot paused. A woman named Maeve Holloway was cast out of Finchley, not fired, not paid off. Cast out. Why? Because she bore a child, the child of Admiral Bertram Hargrove, a child born in secrecy, erased from records, buried in family shame. The Admiral made others swear to silence. But Maeve wrote letters. Letters her brother kept, letters her granddaughter eventually inherited, though she did not understand them until Vale explained. Clara's hand rose to her mouth, but she said nothing. Sebastian Vale planned to expose it, but someone else feared the consequences. The name, the reputation, the fragile house of Hargrove honor. It would collapse. And so Vale was silenced. Poirot stepped toward the desk and held up the black horn button. This was found beneath the cabinet, the same place where Vale discovered the hidden compartment. It matches a coat I examined last night, tucked away in a locked wardrobe in the guest wing. A navy coat, old, styled like a naval officer's. But it was not real. It was costume. Costume used by someone who wished to wear the Admiral's legacy, quite literally. He turned sharply. "Lady Eugenia, you wore that coat the night Vale died." Gasps rippled through the room. Lady Eugenia didn't blink. "You assume much." "I assume only what is proven," Poirot said softly. "Your prints were not on the gun case, but your old gloves, stitched with pearl at the seams, were found burned in the ash pit behind the east garden wall. A maid discovered them. The pearl detailing is unique. One cuff still had soot-stained thread. You tried to destroy them." She said nothing. "You entered the study that night," Poirot continued. "You knew Vale would be alone. You knew the storm would cover the sound. You wore the Admiral's coat not for disguise, but for control. To remind him that this was your house, that no one, not even a journalist with secrets, could threaten what you had preserved for decades. You shot him once. Close range. He never even stood." Lady Eugenia's lips parted. "He was going to ruin everything." Poirot nodded. "And yet he did not, because now, madame, you have." She stepped forward suddenly, her cane striking the floor like a gavel. "I did it for this house, for my husband's name. Do you understand what it means to guard a legacy while men pick at it like vultures?" Dr. Finch recoiled slightly. Clara stared at her, speechless. But Lady Eugenia turned not to Poirot, but to Clara. "I don't hate you," she said, "but I couldn't let him reduce Finchley to scandal. My husband made mistakes, yes, but he did what he thought best. He made me swear to protect what he built. I did, until Vale threatened it all. I had no choice." Poirot stepped forward. "There is always a choice. Madame, yours was murder, and it was made not in defense of truth, but in fear of it." Outside, a car approached, the constables summoned earlier by Hastings. Poirot gave a solemn nod to Foster, who opened the door to let them in. Lady Eugenia did not resist. She handed her cane to Foster, lifted her chin, and walked out with the grace of a woman who had decided her fall would be as dignified as her reign. The room remained silent. Poirot turned to Clara. "The truth is no longer buried." Clara looked up, eyes wide. "And now?" "Now," Poirot said, "you live without shadows." Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The arrest of Lady Eugenia Hargrove sent a shock through the estate that even the rain seemed to acknowledge. That morning's mist thickened into a soft curtain over Finchley's gardens, veiling the grounds in a hush broken only by the crunch of police boots on gravel and the murmured questions of onlookers who had begun to gather at the wrought-iron gates. The constables escorted Lady Eugenia with quiet dignity, as if they too could feel the weight of the history crumbling behind her. She said not a word as she was placed into the police car. Her eyes remained steady, unashamed, but not without sorrow. Poirot stood at the window of the study, watching the car disappear into the fog. Clara remained seated near the fireplace, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Beside her, Hastings looked uneasy, shifting from foot to foot, glancing often at Poirot, as if to ask whether this truly was the end. But Poirot's eyes did not rest. He watched the courtyard for a moment longer, then turned abruptly and made his way to the corridor. Something in his step was different. Not triumphant, not calm, but alert. Hastings followed. "Poirot," he said cautiously, "you've solved the case." She confessed. "What's troubling you?" Poirot did not slow. "My friend, it is precisely because she confessed that I am troubled. Lady Eugenia is many things. Proud, exacting, protective of reputation, but she is not impulsive. She planned Vale's murder, yes, but she did not act entirely alone." Hastings blinked. "You think someone helped her?" "No," Poirot said. "I think someone else was ready to act on their own, and now they believe the danger has passed." They reached the rear corridor of the East Wing, where the guest rooms were housed. Poirot stopped outside Viscountess Breton's door. It was ajar. The bed was neatly made. The wardrobe stood open. A travel bag, half-packed, rested on the armchair. Hastings' brow creased. "She's leaving?" "Without telling anyone," Poirot said quietly. "Which would be strange, unless she had reason to flee." He stepped into the room, moving to the bag. Inside, among the scarves and perfume, was a folder. Poirot opened it delicately. The first page bore the heading of the Daily Clarion. Beneath it, a nearly completed article draft, "From Portraits to Lies. The Quiet Collapse of the Hargrove Legacy." The byline read, "Lily Breton." Good heavens, Hastings breathed. She was going to publish it herself. Poirot's face remained tight. "No, she already had. This is the second version." Suddenly, the front gate bell rang sharply, echoing through the hallways. Poirot turned. "She is making her move." They descended the main staircase, crossing the grand hall just as Foster entered from the side passage, his face flushed with urgency. "Sir, she's gone. She slipped out through the kitchen path. The gardener saw her heading toward the stables, quickly." Poirot and Hastings exchanged a glance, then bolted for the rear entrance. The stable was empty, save for damp hay and the scent of horses long gone. But tracks, fresh and uneven, marked the mud outside. A car. Poirot's eyes swept the drive. "She's taking the old back road," Hastings said. "It leads to the country station." Poirot nodded. "We must follow. Now." They commandeered the constable's motor car, without hesitation. The drive through the winding lane was tense, silent save for the rumble of gravel and the slap of rain on the windshield. Fog hung low, curling around the trees like smoke. But after nearly 10 minutes, they saw it. A grey coupe pulled haphazardly off the road, its door ajar, engine still ticking. Just beyond it, a figure running along the fence line, coat flapping, scarf trailing like a torn ribbon. Poirot emerged from the car and called out, "Madame, stop! There is no dignity in running from ghosts." But Viscountess Breton did not stop. She reached the train platform just as the whistle blew. Its sound low and mournful, but there were no passengers. No train. The tracks were quiet. The platform deserted. The local line had been suspended due to flooding, a posted sign explained in red ink. Poirot approached calmly, rain streaking across his hat brim. "You knew the truth all along," he said. "You helped Vale uncover it. Then, when he refused to let you control the narrative, you tried to discredit him. You took his notes. You delayed the article. And when Lady Eugenia acted, you saw an opportunity, a final version. One in your name." Lily turned, soaked and breathless. "She murdered him, not me." "Indeed," Poirot said. "But you stood back and watched it happen. Perhaps you hoped she would act. Perhaps you whispered just enough to push her there." Her shoulders sagged. "I didn't expect her to actually do it," she said quietly. "I only wanted the truth, but I wanted it on my terms." Poirot nodded solemnly. "That is the tragedy of legacy, madame. When we desire truth not for justice, but for ownership, it ceases to be truth at all." She didn't resist when the constable arrived. She returned to Finchley under silent escort, wet hair clinging to her cheeks, her eyes hollow. Back at the house, Clara stood by the library window. When she saw Poirot return, her voice trembled. "Is it done?" Poirot nodded. "It is. But, she didn't kill him." "No," Poirot replied softly. "But she lit the match." And in Finchley, that had been all it took. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The lamps in Finchley House were lit earlier than usual that evening. A quiet gloom had settled over the estate. Not the heavy darkness of thunderclouds, but something quieter, more subdued, like the last flicker of candlelight before dawn. Clara sat in the conservatory, her hands clasped around a mug of untouched tea, her gaze distant as though she were watching something invisible drift beyond the glass. Across the hall, Poirot stood alone in the Admiral's study, surrounded by the worn textures of wood, ink, and shadowed silence. He had spent the afternoon sorting through everything left behind. Vale's scattered notes, the old staff records, the forgotten photographs. And now, at last, the last fragment of the puzzle had come to rest in his mind. It had always been a question of timing, not just of when Vale had been killed, but when the house itself had begun to rot from within. The portrait, the letters, the sealed compartments, each had offered pieces. Yes, but only now did they align. The murder was not simply an act of passion or fear. It was the final move in a long game, one played across decades. Poirot lit a single lamp on the desk and removed from his pocket a folded page, stained at the edge with oil from the old floorboards. It had been tucked behind one of the Admiral's maps, sealed into the wooden frame, and it bore the signature of Bertram Hargrove himself. The handwriting was sharper than in his later years. Younger, less measured. "If anything should happen, if truth should surface, I trust you to do what must be done. I leave it in your hands, Eugenia. Not because you are loyal, but because you are unyielding." A confession, not of guilt in Vale's murder, of course, but of complicity in the older crime, the shame that had begun this chain. Poirot set the note beside the others and stepped back from the desk, his thoughts moving faster than his pulse. Behind him, Hastings entered quietly, removing his coat and glancing around the room. "It's quiet," he said, "the kind of quiet that feels too deep." Poirot nodded. "It is the quiet of truth, mon ami. It has landed, and now it waits." Hastings came closer, his eyes resting on the note. "Another letter?" "The last one," Poirot replied. "The Admiral left instructions, not just to hide the truth, but to ensure it stayed buried. And he chose Lady Eugenia because she could be trusted to protect the name, not the truth. That choice led to everything else. And Vale. He dug too deep. But it was Viscountess Breton who gave him the shovel, and when he refused to hand it back, she looked away, and Lady Eugenia did what the Admiral always knew she might. There was silence for a moment. Then Hastings said, "So it was always meant to happen?" "No," Poirot replied softly, "but it was always possible. That is what legacy does. It turns possibility into inevitability when people choose silence over truth." Footsteps approached the doorway. Clara appeared, her eyes cautious but no longer afraid. She looked first at Poirot, then at the document spread on the desk. "Will the story be published?" she asked. Poirot studied her a moment. "That depends. Would you want it to be?" She hesitated. "Not for revenge. Not even for my mother or Maeve. Just so that it doesn't happen again. So someone doesn't think they can cover pain with silence and call it dignity." Poirot smiled gently. "Then yes, the story will be told, but not by the Clarion, and not by those who sought to own it. You will decide how it is shared, and when." Clara's shoulders seemed to ease as though a weight had finally lifted. She stepped forward and gently touched the edge of one of Vale's notebooks, then looked up toward the portrait still looming above the mantel. "I used to think he was watching me," she said. "Now I think he was just looking for someone to speak." Poirot followed her gaze. The Admiral's eyes, painted in deep strokes of grey and navy, seemed no less stern than before. But they no longer held mystery, only memory. Later that night, as the house began to still once more and the constables departed in silence, Poirot and Hastings walked the long corridor leading to the east wing. Rain had returned, soft, steady, cleansing. Outside, the hedgerows trembled. The lanterns flickered as they passed. "You'll be heading back to London, I suppose," Hastings said. "Soon," Poirot answered, "but not just yet. There is one thing left." "Oh?" Poirot stopped outside the locked study door once more. "There is a story that no one will read, a truth that exists only here, within these walls, and I must say farewell to it properly." Hastings smiled faintly. "Do you ever let a case go?" Poirot touched the doorknob but didn't turn it. "Only after I have thanked it for what it revealed. Not about the killer, but about the people who chose not to be." He turned then, and they walked back toward the drawing room where the fire had been relit and the house, finally, had begun to feel warm again. Above the mantel, the portrait remained. It did not blink. It did not whisper. But now, at last, it was watching nothing more than what it had always watched, the quiet place where truth had waited patiently to be seen. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The following day brought with it a golden hush, the kind of light that spilled across old rugs and velvet chairs like a blessing, though none dared call it that. Finchley, once cloaked in fog and silence, now sat exposed in the warmth of a late morning sun. The estate looked unchanged to the eye, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. The corridors were quieter now, not because of dread, but because of aftermath. The truth had stirred every corner of the house, and now, with the murder solved and the names spoken aloud, Poirot requested one final gathering, not for justice, which had already taken its course, but for understanding. The drawing-room had been reset, the curtains were drawn wide to welcome the light, and the Admiral's portrait, untouched above the fireplace, stood guard over the assembled guests. But it was no longer the same room. Its silence now bore the weight of confession and the soft echo of remorse. Clara sat near the hearth, her posture straighter than before, her eyes clear. She no longer looked like someone lost in someone else's history. She looked present. Beside her sat Henry Haskett, protective as ever, though subdued, his hands resting calmly in his lap. Dr. Finch leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, his journal left closed at his side. Even he seemed humbled by the revelations. Viscountess Breton, released under house scrutiny for her part in the deception, took a seat opposite Poirot with stiff grace, her chin held high despite the weight pressing on her shoulders. Poirot entered last, impeccably dressed as ever, but with no trace of theatricality. Today there was no performance. He stood before them not as a detective demanding answers, but as a man preparing to lay down the final pieces of a broken mirror. "I've asked you here," he began gently, "not to accuse, no, that has already been done, nor to condemn, though the law will see its due. I've called you together because there is something that still lingers in this house, something that must not be left unsaid." He looked toward the fireplace, toward the portrait. "For years, Finchley has been a place of silence, not peaceful silence, but the kind that thickens in the throat and dulls the edges of truth. Lady Eugenia, in her devotion to legacy, built walls not just of stone, but of omission. And within those walls, many of you learned to survive by breathing shallowly, speaking carefully, and looking away." Clara's gaze dropped for a moment, but Poirot's voice remained calm. "But murder does not bloom in a single moment. It grows, fed by years of denial, watered by pride, and shaded by shame. Sebastian Vale died because he dared to speak plainly. He was flawed, yes, impertinent, even cruel, but he did what no one else dared. He peeled back the varnish. He exposed the wound. He turned to Viscountess Breton. You, madame, saw the value in his discoveries. But you wished to own them. You wished to shape the truth, polish it, publish it under your name. And when he refused, you stepped aside. You did not kill him, no, but your silence was a choice." Lily looked away, her lips tight. Poirot continued, "Dr. Finch, you knew of Maeve Holloway. You remembered the stories whispered in your youth. You suspected the truth, perhaps even feared it. But you said nothing. You told yourself it was not your place. But silence is never neutral when others are harmed by it." Finch nodded slowly, his eyes dark with regret. "Henry Haskett," Poirot said, turning. "You sought justice for your aunt, though you did not know her, and you protected your daughter with every breath. But you, too, were not without misstep. You brought Clara to a house that hurt her grandmother, hoping it would heal her, but she did not need a house. She needed the truth." Haskett swallowed hard and placed a hand on Clara's. Poirot's voice softened as he looked at her. "And you, mademoiselle, were the light in this shadow. You who remembered, even when you didn't understand, who felt the weight of something unspoken and refused to let it press you into silence. It was your voice, timid though it may have seemed, that broke open the truth." Clara did not speak, but her eyes filled, not with tears, but with something steadier. Recognition. Resolution. Poirot stepped back, folding his hands. This house has borne witness to grief, pride, guilt, and silence. But now it must bear something else. Truth. Let it echo through these walls, not to shame those who lived here, but to remind them, to remind all of us that silence can be more dangerous than lies. He gave a slight nod toward the portrait. "The Admiral no longer needs to watch, because now there is nothing left to hide." He turned and walked to the doorway, pausing just before leaving. "Let this be the final gathering," he said. "Not of suspects, but of survivors." And with that, Poirot departed the room, leaving behind only the fire, the light, and the long, slow breath of a house finally allowed to exhale. Chapter 16. The Reveal. The evening air hung heavy with expectation as the guests reconvened in the drawing room, now stripped of all pretense and polished veneers. The once lively chatter had been replaced by a tense silence, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire. The Admiral's portrait loomed overhead, its painted eyes seemingly watching the gathering with an unyielding gaze. But the time for subtlety had passed. Poirot stood near the hearth, his small grey cells humming with the clarity of a final, intricate design coming into focus. "My friends," he began, his voice measured and calm, "we have walked together through shadows, secrets, and silence. The truth we seek is not a single moment in time, but a tapestry woven across decades with threads of loyalty, fear, and human frailty. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. His eyes swept over the faces of those present. Clara, no longer fragile but resolute. Henry Haskett, burdened yet dignified. Dr. Finch, his composure strained but honest. Viscountess Breton, her proud facade softened by defeat, and Lady Eugenia, now absent, her actions having set these revelations into motion. The crime of last week, Poirot continued, was born not merely of a single act, but of a legacy of silence and betrayal. Sebastian Vale was killed because he threatened to unravel a secret long buried, a secret tied to the disappearance of Maeve Holloway, the servant who bore a child in secrecy and was cast out in shame. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the small black horn button found near the hidden floor compartment. This button, mon ami, is more than a mere piece of attire. It belonged to a coat worn by someone who sought to embody the Admiral's authority, a symbol of control and intimidation. And it was Lady Eugenia who wore that coat the night Sebastian died. A sharp intake of breath swept the room. Poirot did not flinch. Lady Eugenia, driven by pride and fear for her family's name, took it upon herself to silence Vale. The gunshot, masked by the storm, was meant to preserve the past, but as we now know, the past cannot be so easily buried. He turned toward Viscountess Breton. Madame, you did not pull the trigger, but you wielded influence over Vale's fate. Your desire to control the narrative led to the withholding of his notes and to the attempt to reshape his discoveries into your own story. Viscountess Breton's lips pressed tightly, her gaze falling. Dr. Finch, Poirot said, his tone gentler, you inherited silence as part of your family legacy. Your father's position as the Admiral's physician gave you knowledge and perhaps fear that compelled you to stay quiet. But you did not commit the murder. He looked now at Henry Haskett. Monsieur, you came seeking answers for your aunt, Maeve's sister, and to protect your daughter. You are part of this history, but not its author. Finally, his gaze settled on Clara. And you, mademoiselle, are the light in the darkness. Your courage to speak, to remember, and to trust in truth has brought us here. He folded his hands. The portrait above us did not blink, as some claimed. It bore witness, silently, an emblem of all the stories left unspoken. But tonight, those stories have found voice. The room was still. Then Clara spoke softly. What happens now? Poirot smiled, warmth returning to his voice. Now the story will be told. Not to condemn, but to heal. To remind us that silence can breed shadows far darker than any painting. He turned toward the door. And as for Finchley, it is time it was no longer a prison of secrets, but a home of truth. The guests rose, each changed in some subtle way. The fire burned brighter, casting away the last remnants of night. And above the mantel, the portrait watched, not with menace, but with the quiet dignity of history, finally acknowledged. Poirot paused in the doorway, glancing back once more. In every shadow, he said softly, there is light waiting to be found. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The morning after the revelation dawned with a fragile sense of calm over Finchley House. The heavy clouds that had clung to the estate for days had finally broken, letting the sunlight spill in through wide-open windows and drying the lingering dampness from the gardens. The weight of secrets, once so thick it seemed to bend the very air, was now lifted, replaced by the quiet, sober task of facing consequences. Though the portrait of Admiral Hargrove still gazed down from its place above the fireplace, it no longer bore the ominous watchfulness it once had. Instead, it seemed a witness to the reckoning that had unfolded within these walls. Lady Eugenia's arrest had set in motion a series of formal inquiries. The law moved methodically, gathering statements, corroborating facts, and preparing the case that would follow. But within Finchley, justice was not merely a matter of courts and verdicts. It was personal, intertwined with the fragile bonds of family and loyalty stretched to their limits. The guests, once suspects, had become survivors of a shared trauma, each carrying their own burden of guilt and grief. Clara Haskett, whose voice had pierced the silence and begun the unraveling of decades-old shadows, found herself at the center of a quiet support that surprised even her. Henry Haskett remained steadfast by her side, offering both protection and comfort, while Poirot's presence was a steady reminder that truth, though sometimes painful, could also be a path to healing. Dr. Finch, though never charged, chose to leave Finchley quietly, his departure marked by a mixture of relief and sorrow. A man who had lived too long under the weight of unspoken complicity. Viscountess Breton's fate was more complicated. Cleared of direct involvement in the murder, she faced a social reckoning that would linger far beyond any legal consequences. Her ambition, once veiled behind charm and cunning, had been laid bare, forcing her to confront the cost of wielding power without conscience. The final draft of Sebastian Vale's article, recovered and now entrusted to Clara, promised to restore truth where deception had thrived, but it also carried the weight of reputations fractured and alliances shattered. As the days passed, Poirot took moments alone in the study, gazing once more at the portrait that had silently watched over the house for so many years. It was a reminder that beneath the grandeur of legacy and the permanence of paint lay the complex, often painful humanity of those who had lived, loved, and erred within these walls. The silence that once had protected secrets now had been broken, and with it, the possibility of new beginnings. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the estate, Poirot and Hastings prepared to leave Finchley. The case had concluded, but its lessons lingered. Hastings looked toward the house, his face thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder how many stories remain hidden in places like this, Poirot?" Poirot smiled gently, adjusting his hat. "Mon ami, there are always stories. The role of the detective is to coax them out into the light, so they may no longer haunt the corners of our lives. Finchley has taught us that truth is not just a fact to be found, but a burden to be carried, and sometimes a mercy to be granted." As they stepped into the waiting carriage, Poirot took one last look at the house. The windows gleamed with reflected light, and the gardens seemed to breathe anew. The portrait's gaze was softened by distance, its secrets finally laid to rest. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said softly. "It is time to go home. But Finchley will remain in my memory, not as a house of shadows, but as a place where truth, at last, was set free." The carriage rolled away, carrying them through the estate's gates and into the quiet road beyond, leaving behind the story of the blinking portrait, a story of silence, betrayal, and the enduring power of the little grey cells to illuminate even the darkest of mysteries. Chapter 18. The Closing Remark. The carriage rattled along the winding country road, carrying Hercule Poirot and Hastings away from Finchley House, its ivy-clad walls receding behind a veil of morning mist. The village church spire appeared briefly through the fog, standing as a solemn sentinel over the secrets laid bare within the estate. Poirot sat quietly, his gaze distant yet serene, his fingers steepled as always, the weight of the case settling gently on his thoughts. Hastings broke the silence at last. "Well, Poirot, I suppose this is the end of the story. A tangled web, a long-buried secret, and justice served." Poirot smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth turning up with a knowing grace. "Yes, Hastings. But a story such as this reminds us that human nature is a delicate and complex instrument. It plays melodies of love, pride, and fear, sometimes in discord, sometimes in harmony. It is the role of the detective not only to unravel the crimes, but to understand the hearts that beat behind them. Hastings leaned back, thoughtful. You think Lady Eugenia did what she thought was right? Poirot nodded slowly. Indeed, she was the guardian of a legacy, burdened by loyalty and fear. Her crime was born from the desire to protect, however misguided. Yet the greatest crime is silence. Silence that festers and suffocates until it demands a toll far heavier than truth ever would. He paused, his eyes fixed on the receding trees, the soft patter of rain against the window. The portrait that blinked was not a ghost, but a symbol. The eyes of history watching us, reminding us that secrets once buried often find their way to the surface. Hastings smiled ruefully. So, the little grey cells have done it again. Poirot chuckled softly. Ah, mon ami, the little grey cells are but a lamp in the dark. It is the courage to seek the light that truly matters. As the carriage disappeared into the rolling countryside, Finchley House remained behind, a silent monument not only to a past shrouded in shadows, but to a future where truth could finally breathe. The story of the blinking portrait had ended, but its lesson lingered, that in the dance of secrets and lies, only honesty leads to peace. Poirot adjusted his hat and settled deeper into his seat, the faintest smile playing on his lips. Until the next mystery, Hastings, he said softly, may we always see clearly, even when others choose to close their eyes.